11:45 on the morning of June 16, 1942, a 30-year-old man in civilian clothes walked through the entrance of Petschek Palace in central Prague. He was not being dragged. He was not in handcuffs. He came alone. His name was Karel Čurda. 3 months earlier, he had jumped from a British Halifax bomber into the darkness over occupied Czechoslovakia, a trained saboteur, a soldier of the resistance, a man who had volunteered to fight the Nazis behind enemy lines. Now he was walking into Gestapo headquarters of his own free will. The guards noticed his hands were trembling. He was sweating despite the cool morning. He chain-smoked as he waited. When the officer finally received him, Čurda spoke quickly, nervously, glancing toward the door as if he might still change his mind. He said he wanted to make a statement. He said he knew who had killed Reinhard Heydrich. What Karel Čurda did not fully understand was that in the next 48 hours, his words would send hundreds of people to their deaths, including 7 of his own comrades, the woman who had fed him, and a 21-year-old boy who would be tortured until he broke. He had come to save his family. He would destroy everyone else's. 5 years later, on April 29, 1947, Karel Čurda stood in the dock at the Extraordinary People's Court in Prague. The charges were clear: high treason, collaboration with the enemy, responsibility for the deaths of hundreds of Czech patriots. The evidence was overwhelming. Čurda did not deny what he had done. When the prosecutor asked him the question that everyone in the courtroom wanted answered, how could you betray your own comrades, men who trusted you, men who would have died for you? Čurda gave an answer that would echo through Czech history. I think you would have done the same for 1,000,000 marks. For 1,000,000 marks, 7 words that captured something terrible about human nature. Not ideology, not conviction, just money and fear. The judge who heard those words, the witnesses who remembered them, the historians who would quote them for decades. None of them ever forgot. In that single sentence, Čurda revealed the hollow core of his betrayal. He had not been a committed collaborator. He had not believed in the Nazi cause. He had simply been a man who broke under pressure and sold his soul for survival. For 1,000,000 marks, the phrase would follow him to the gallows. Karel Čurda was born on October 10, 1911, in Nová Hlína, a small village near Třebon in southern Bohemia. His parents were laborers. He trained as a bricklayer, played the trumpet, and eventually joined the Czechoslovak army. When the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Čurda did what thousands of young Czech men did. He fled. He made his way to Poland, then France, then Britain, joining the Czechoslovak forces in exile. His service record was good. His evaluations described him as capable, determined, reliable. In late 1941, he volunteered for Special Operations training in Scotland. The British Special Operations Executive was preparing teams of Czechoslovak agents to be dropped into the Protectorate for sabotage and intelligence work. Čurda was assigned to a group codenamed Outdistance, commanded by Lieutenant Adolf Opálka. On March 27, 1942, Čurda parachuted into occupied Czechoslovakia, along with Opálka and a third agent, Ivan Kolářík. The mission went wrong from the start. They landed far from their target zone. Kolářík was quickly discovered and took his own life rather than be captured. Opálka was injured. Čurda found himself alone. This was the first crack. The paratroopers had been trained to operate as teams, to support each other, to share the psychological burden of living underground in enemy territory. Čurda had none of that. He drifted between safe houses, spent time with his family in Nová Hlína, and grew increasingly isolated from the other agents. Meanwhile, 2 other paratroopers, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, of Operation Anthropoid, were preparing the most audacious assassination of the war, the killing of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the architect of the final solution, the man Hitler called the man with the iron heart. On May 27, 1942, Gabčík and Kubiš attacked Heydrich's open Mercedes at a hairpin turn in Prague. Gabčík's Sten gun jammed. Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade. Heydrich was wounded by shrapnel and fragments of the car's upholstery that were driven into his body. 8 days later, on June 4th, Reinhard Heydrich died of sepsis. The Nazi response was immediate and merciless. What followed was called the Heydrichiada, a campaign of terror unlike anything the Czechs had experienced. The Gestapo launched a massive manhunt. Every day the newspapers published new lists of the executed. Entire families were shot for the slightest suspicion of involvement. The village of Lidis was surrounded on June 10th. All 173 men over 15 were executed. The women were sent to Ravensbrück. The children were gassed at Chelmno or given to German families. The village was burned, bulldozed, and erased from maps. 2 weeks later, the village of Ležáky suffered the same fate. The message was clear. Until the assassins were found, the killing would not stop. For 3 weeks, the Gestapo found nothing. Despite thousands of arrests, despite torture, despite the execution of over 2,000 people, no one talked. The Czech underground held firm. Then the Nazis announced an amnesty. Anyone who came forward with information leading to the assassins would be spared and rewarded. 5 million protectorate crowns. A fortune. Karel Čurda was hiding at his mother's house in Nová Hlína when he heard about Lidis. He read the daily lists of the executed. He saw the names of people he knew, the families of other paratroopers, the relatives of agents he had trained with in Britain. He knew that if he was discovered, his mother, his brothers, his sisters, and their children would all be killed. The Nazis had made that perfectly clear. The psychological pressure was immense. Čurda was alone, isolated from his comrades, hiding in an attic while the world outside descended into mass murder. He had no one to share the burden, no commanding officer to give him orders, no fellow soldiers to remind him of his duty. He began to crack. On June 13th, 1942, Karel Čurda wrote an anonymous letter to the gendarmerie station in Benešov. He identified Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš as the assassins. He gave their descriptions, their backgrounds, their Slovak and Moravian origins. The letter was ignored, just one of thousands of tips flooding the authorities. 3 days later, Čurda made his decision. He took a train to Prague. He visited the apartment of Josef and Marie Svatoš, who had sheltered paratroopers. He was visibly agitated, sweating, trembling, smoking constantly, pacing to the window. The Svatoš family later testified that they had to tell him to stop, that his behavior would attract attention. He asked where Gabčík and Kubiš were hiding. They did not tell him. Perhaps they did not know. Perhaps they sensed something was wrong. Then Karel Čurda walked to Petschek Palace and gave the Gestapo everything. He did not know the current hiding place of the assassins, but he knew the safe houses. He knew the contact addresses. He knew names, dozens of names of people who had helped the paratroopers in Prague, Pardubice, Plzeň, and Lázně Bělehrad. The Gestapo had spent 3 weeks finding nothing. In one afternoon, Čurda handed them the entire resistance network, except there was one thing he could not give them, the location of the crypt. While Karel Čurda was talking to the Gestapo, 7 paratroopers were hiding in the crypt beneath the church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Reslova Street. Gabčík and Kubiš were there, along with Adolf Opalka, Čurda's own commanding officer, and 4 others, Josef Valčík, Josef Bublik, Jan Hruby, and Jaroslav Schwarz. They had been underground for weeks. The church's Orthodox priest, Father Vladimir Petschek, and the bishop Gorazd had agreed to shelter them despite the mortal risk. At 4 a.m. on June 17th, Gestapo Commissioner Heinz Panwitz led a raid on the apartment of the Moravec family at Biskupčova, 7 in Žižkov. This was one of the addresses Čurda had provided. Marie Moravcová, the woman everyone called Auntie, had been one of the most devoted helpers of the paratroopers. She had fed them, hidden them, passed messages, and risked her life every day. When the Gestapo burst in, she asked to use the toilet. Inside, she bit down on a cyanide capsule she had carried for exactly this moment. Her husband Alois was arrested, but their 21-year-old son Vlastimil, known as Ata, was not home. The Gestapo sent a fake telegram. "Mother seriously ill, come immediately." Ata came. He was arrested, taken to Petschek Palace and subjected to torture that lasted hours. According to some accounts, the Gestapo showed him his mother's severed head. Whether this is true or not, what is certain is that Ata Moravec broke. He told them about the church. At 4:15 a.m. on June 18th, 1942, approximately 750 SS and Gestapo men surrounded the church of Saints Cyril and Methodius. The 7 paratroopers inside heard the commotion. 3 of them, Opalka, Kubiš, and Bublik, were in the prayer loft above the nave. They opened fire. For 2 hours they held off the assault. Jan Kubiš was badly wounded by a grenade. Adolf Opalka, the man who had commanded Karel Čurda, was hit in the chest. Kubiš and Bublik died in the loft. Some accounts say Opalka shot himself rather than be taken alive. By 7 a.m., the Germans discovered the entrance to the crypt. The remaining 4 paratroopers, Gabčík, Valčík, Hruby, and Schwarz, were trapped below. The SS tried to flood the crypt with water from fire hoses. The paratroopers kept fighting. They tried to tunnel through a wall to the sewers. They fired through the narrow ventilation shaft. At approximately 11 a.m., after nearly 7 hours of battle, the firing stopped. When the Germans finally entered the crypt, they found all 4 men dead, killed by their own hands rather than surrender, and Karel Čurda was brought to identify the bodies. The bodies of the 7 paratroopers were laid out on the pavement at the corner of Reslova Street. Karel Čurda walked among them, pointing, confirming identities. This was the man who had trained alongside them in Scotland, the man who had jumped from the same aircraft as Adolf Opalka, the man who had shared meals with Josef Gabčík at the Moravec apartment. Now he was helping the Gestapo catalogue the dead. The killing did not stop with the paratroopers. Over the following weeks, the Gestapo used the information Čurda had provided to roll up the entire resistance network. The arrests numbered in the hundreds. On October 24, 1942, a transport of 262 people arrived at Mauthausen concentration camp. Among them were Alois Moravec and his son Ata. They were all executed that day, shot at 2-minute intervals in the camp's execution yard. Ata Moravec was 21 years old. His father was 55. His mother had been dead for 4 months. Karel Čurda received his reward, 5 million protectorate crowns. He was given a new identity, Karl Gerhard, and German citizenship. He married a German woman named Antonie. They had a son, but Čurda was not free. The Gestapo knew everything about him now. They used him as a paid informant, deploying him to help track down other paratroopers dropped in later waves. He helped destroy the antimony and bivouac groups. The money did not bring him peace. He drank heavily. His handlers noted his deteriorating condition. By the end of the war, even the Gestapo had little use for him. He had become exactly what the psychologists would later describe, a man who had identified with his aggressors, who had committed himself so deeply to betrayal that he could not stop, who drank to forget what he had done and could never forget. For 1 million marks he had sold everything, and he had to keep selling to live with himself. On May 5, 1945, the Prague uprising began. The war was ending. The Nazis were collapsing. Karel Čurda knew what was coming. He fled Prague with his wife and son, heading west toward the American lines. On May 15th, he walked into a police station in Magnetin and turned himself in. He claimed to be a Czechoslovak paratrooper, which was technically true. For a few days, no one knew the full extent of what he had done. He was even issued a certificate confirming his service in the resistance. Then the truth emerged. Witness after witness came forward. The evidence was undeniable. Karel Čurda was arrested and held for trial. His wife, Antony, burned nearly 4 million crowns of his blood money in their courtyard. His son was taken to Austria. He would never see either of them again. The trial of Karel Čurda and William Garrick, another paratrooper who had collaborated, opened on April 28, 1947. The evidence took less than a day to present. The verdict was never in doubt. When asked if he wished to request clemency from President Edvard Beneš, Čurda declined. According to witnesses, he seemed relieved that it was finally ending. On April 29, 1947, at 11:45 a.m., William Garrick was led to the gallows in the courtyard of Pankrak prison. His last words were reportedly, "Do you want me to say hello to anyone in heaven?" 12 minutes later, at 11:57 a.m., Karel Čurda followed him. He asked for a final cigarette. Then the trapdoor opened. He was 35 years old. History remembers Karel Čurda as a traitor, and he was. His information led directly to the deaths of hundreds of people and the destruction of the Czech resistance in Prague. But Čurda was also a volunteer who had risked his life to fight the Nazis. He had trained as a saboteur and jumped into occupied territory knowing he might never return. What he lacked was the inner strength to face the consequences alone. Isolation broke him where bullets might not have. Today, visitors to the Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius can descend into the crypt where the 7 paratroopers made their last stand. The bullet holes are still visible in the walls. The ventilation shaft they fired through remains. Karel Čurda has no grave that anyone visits, but the lesson of Karel Čurda endures. For 1,000,000 marks, he said it himself as if it explained everything, and perhaps it did for him. Some men find their price, others discover they have none. The 7 in the crypt knew which they were. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Prague to Sydney, from veterans' families to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.